Something about this story never sat right. Not the marriage. Not the silence. And definitely not the moment a private suspicion turned into a family demand no one could ignore. Because when a leaked tape surfaced one that allegedly placed Erika in contact with an ex during her marriage, the situation quietly crossed a line. What had once been dismissed as rumor suddenly carried weight. And now, according to people close to the family, Charlie Kirk's parents are pushing for a DNA test. Not out of spite. Not for publicity. But because, as those close to them claim, trust had already collapsed long before the public ever caught on. Tonight, we're breaking down how a carefully maintained image began to fracture. Why leaked evidence changed everything. And how this situation escalated into one of the most serious and personal demands a family can make. Before we begin, make sure to like this video, share it with others following this case. Subscribe for more true crime investigations, and comment below with your thoughts. Do you believe this was about protection or control? And let us know where you're watching from. At first, the concerns were easy to dismiss. In any long-term relationship, small inconsistencies can be explained away misremembered dates. Unclear timelines, stories that sound slightly different over time. And for a while, that's exactly how these moments were treated. But according to sources familiar with the situation, the same questions kept resurfacing. Charlie began noticing how conversations about Erika's past often lacked specifics. When pressed gently, details stayed broad. Names were rarely mentioned. Dates were never precise. And certain years' entire stretches of time were described in ways that felt unusually clean. Almost curated. What raised more concern wasn't just what was said, but what was avoided. There were reports of social overlaps that didn't match the narrative Erika had publicly maintained. People from earlier chapters of her life appeared in places they supposedly shouldn't have. Connections emerged that conflicted with the idea of a quiet, isolated path leading directly to marriage. Still, none of this was public. And none of it, on its own, proved anything. Charlie didn't accuse. He didn't confront. Instead, those close to him say he became more reserved, less expressive, more controlled in what he shared. Decisions became more deliberate. Boundaries, especially around personal matters, grew firmer. To outsiders, nothing looked wrong. But inside the marriage, something had shifted. Because when doubt lingers without answers, it doesn't disappear. It waits. And that waiting is exactly what made the next development impossible to ignore. When private suspicion collided with something tangible, something recorded, everything changed when the evidence stopped being theoretical. According to multiple reports, a leaked tape began circulating privately before it ever reached wider attention. The audio allegedly placed Erika in contact with an ex during a period that directly overlapped with her marriage. And while the contents of the tape have not been officially verified, what made it explosive was how closely it appeared to align with questions that had already been raised behind closed doors. This wasn't a random accusation surfacing online. It was material that seemed to fill in gaps timelines that suddenly made sense in ways they hadn't before. People familiar with the situation say the tape didn't introduce new doubts. It confirmed old ones. Alongside the audio, other materials were reportedly re-examined photos. Social media activity, past appearances, and public records that had once gone unnoticed. Individually, none of these pieces proved wrongdoing. But together, they painted a picture that was difficult to reconcile with the narrative Erika had consistently presented. What stood out most was consistency. The dates referenced in the leaked material appeared to line up with periods Erika had previously described as dormant times she claimed were free of romantic involvement. And for those who had already questioned the story, that alignment felt less like coincidence and more like corroboration. Still, Charlie did not go public. There was no state nuisation. No confrontation aired for an audience. Instead, according to people close to the family, this was the moment the issue shifted from personal doubt to private action. Because once evidence alleged or not enters the picture, silence becomes a choice, not a default. And while the public remained largely unaware, something far more consequential was happening behind the scenes. Because the leaked tape didn't just raise questions about fidelity. It raised questions about truth itself. And once that line is crossed, every previous statement gets re-examined. Once the leaked tape entered the picture, attention shifted backward. People didn't just focus on what the audio allegedly revealed, they began comparing it to what had been said for years. Public interviews, past statements, carefully repeated talking points about discipline, boundaries, and a life untouched by modern dating culture. And that's where the contradictions became harder to dismiss in multiple appearances. Erika had drawn a clear line between herself and what she described as a culture of casual relationships. She spoke about avoiding dating altogether, rejecting social scenes centered around drinking, and choosing restraint long before marriage ever entered the picture. That narrative wasn't vague, it was intentional, consistent, and often emphasized. But when timelines from the leaked material were placed alongside those statements, they didn't align. Reports began resurfacing of past relationships that contradicted claims of prolonged singleness, archived interviews, social posts, and third-party accounts suggested a far more active social and romantic life than what had been publicly acknowledged. Again, none of this proved infidelity on its own, but it directly challenged the idea that nothing existed to hide. What made this more troubling was repetition. This wasn't one disputed year. It wasn't one unclear relationship. It was a pattern of minimization, entire chapters reduced to footnotes or erased altogether. According to people familiar with Charlie's perspective, this was the point where trust took a deeper hit. Not because of any single allegation, but because the story itself no longer felt stable. When explanations require constant adjustment, credibility starts to erode. And credibility matters especially in relationships built on public values and private promises. Because once contradictions stack up, the question stops being, is this true? It becomes why work's so hard to control the narrative. And that question led directly into something more unsettling, the possibility that image wasn't just being protected, but strategically constructed. At this stage, the story stopped being about a single allegation and started becoming about behavior. True crime analysis often focuses less on isolated actions and more on patterns, especially when those patterns involve identity, control, and long-term strategy. And according to observers who followed this closely, the contradictions surrounding Erika's past suggested something deeper than simple misrepresentation. The image she presented wasn't casual. It was precise. A disciplined background. A clean, romantic history. A faith-centered identity aligned with the values of the environment she later entered. That kind of consistency doesn't happen by accident. Experts who study behavioral patterns note that when individuals repeatedly reshape their past, it's often not about hiding one mistake, it's about maintaining access. Access to credibility, access to influence, access to environments where image carries weight. And in this case, image was currency. What made this especially significant was how seamlessly Erika moved through overlapping social and professional circles, connections that appeared unrelated on the surface political events. Professional introductions. Personal relationships began to look interconnected when viewed over time. According to reports, key introductions in her life didn't happen randomly. They happened through people already positioned within the same power structures she later benefited from. That overlap raised an uncomfortable question. Was the narrative of chance meetings and organic connection accurate? Or was it simplified for public consumption? Again, none of this proves intent. But intent isn't the only thing analysts look for. They look for incentive. And the incentive here was clear stability, legitimacy, and proximity to power. When those things are on the line, narrative control becomes essential. And once a narrative is established, protecting it can mean minimizing, reframing, or quietly erasing anything that threatens it. For Charlie, according to those close to him, this realization changed how he viewed not just the past but the future. Because when someone's identity appears carefully constructed, trust doesn't break all at once. It fractures slowly. The turning point came not with argument or confrontation but with action. According to sources close to the family, what had been private suspicion and cautious observation suddenly required intervention. The leaked tape, combined with years of patterns, created a situation where silence was no longer safe. Questions that could once be ignored now demanded answers. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about drama. It was about clarity and protection. Charlie's parents reportedly stepped in at this moment. People familiar with their perspective described them as deeply concerned not just for their son, but for the truth of the matter. The request for a DNA test, according to insiders, wasn't impulsive. It was a deliberate step, intended to resolve lingering questions once and for all. What made this moment pivotal wasn't the test itself. It was the escalation it represented. For years, questions had simmered quietly in private conversations. Doubts were noted, patterns analyzed, and inconsistencies catalogued. But when a family member demands verification in a situation this personal, everything changes. Alleged behaviors, inconsistencies, and withheld truths can no longer remain in the shadows. The dynamic shifted. The stakes became clear. Trust, already fragile, was now in the balance sand. Every decision from this point on would carry weight far beyond the individuals directly involved. And in true crime, turning points like this are rarely clean. They're messy, emotional, and irreversible, and they force the story into its next phase, the escalation of family involvement, legal considerations, and the pressure of public perception. Once the turning point was reached, the family moved from observers to active participants. According to multiple sources, Charlie's parents did not intervene lightly. Their involvement, people say, was driven by concern for their son's well-being and by a desire for clarity in a situation that had grown increasingly complex. The request for an attest, in particular, symbolized far more than scientific verification. It was a demand for transparency, a step toward certainty in a world clouded by secrecy and conflicting narratives. Insiders suggest that, privately, the parents were meticulous. They reviewed timelines, cross-referenced statements, and weighed the potential consequences of every move. The leaked tape had already made waves, but it was the possibility of lasting deception that truly alarmed them. And for them, resolving these questions was as much about protecting the family's integrity as it was about establishing the truth. This intervention, however, did not occur in a vacuum. Word of the tape and the parents' involvement began to circulate beyond private circles. Though details remained incomplete, rumors of a DNA test and alleged infidelity quickly found their way into public discussion. And that's where stakes escalated further. Suddenly, what had begun as a private matter was intersecting with reputation, perception, and the scrutiny of outsiders. Family dynamics, once quiet and private, became central to the story. Tensions reportedly grew between those pushing for answers and those trying to maintain distance. Every communication, every decision, was now weighed against both personal relationships and potential public fallout. In true crime terms, this stage represents the escalation, the moment when suspicion and evidence, combined with familial pressure, create a chain reaction that forces the situation into legal, ethical, and emotional arenas. With the family now fully involved, the situation evolved from private doubt into a matter with real-world consequences. The request for a DNA test, according to sources, carried more than scientific weight. It carried legal, moral, and emotional implications. Custody questions, inheritance considerations, and the integrity of family relationships all suddenly became part of the conversation. And for those involved, every decision was not just about uncovering the truth, but about managing the fallout once that truth, whatever it might be, was revealed. Emotionally, the impact was profound. People close to the situation report that Charlie became increasingly withdrawn, navigating a difficult balance between loyalty, skepticism, and the desire to protect his children. Erika, according to insiders, faced the pressure of public scrutiny alongside the weight of private questioning. And the parents, while determined to uncover clarity, carried their own emotional burden, the tension between support, judgment, and responsibility. Morally, this stage is where true crime often highlights the complexity of human decisions. What is the right course of action when personal relationships, trust, and public accountability collide? The answer is rarely clear. Every choice risks alienation, heartbreak, or misunderstanding, even when intentions are grounded in protection. Legally, the presence of DNA as a potential arbiter of truth adds an entirely new layer. It is not just evidence, it is a symbol of certainty in a situation clouded by conflicting narratives and hidden histories. And as is often the case in true crime, the pursuit of clarity in such personal matters can itself generate tension, conflict, and unintended consequences. Even with the leaked tape, patterns of contradiction, and parental intervention, the story is far from resolved. Several questions linger, and in true crime, it's these unanswered elements that keep the narrative alive. Were there aspects of Erika's past still hidden? What might the DNA test reveal, and how will it affect custody or family trust? Were all the inconsistencies deliberate, or were some the result of misremembered timelines? How much did Charlie know, and what decisions did he make in private that will never be fully understood? And finally, what does this story say about the fragile line between public image and private, reality especially when children are involved? As with many true crime cases, the truth is multi-layered. Some pieces may never come to light. Others may emerge slowly, one leak at a time. What remains clear is that the foundation of trust in this family has been deeply shaken. In the end, this story is not just about one alleged act, one leaked tape, or even a requested DNA test. It is about trust tested, truth questioned, and relationships strained under the weight of secrecy and perception. Every allegation, every inconsistency, and every private doubt has forced those involved to confront difficult realities. And while some answers may arrive, others may remain forever out of reach. For viewers, the takeaway is clear. In situations where image, influence, and personal history collide, the line between appearance and reality can blur in ways that are both subtle and profound. Families face decisions that are morally complex, emotionally charged, and deeply consequential. And sometimes, the most significant truths are the ones that remain just beyond reach. As always, this is a story still unfolding, and the implications may continue to ripple for years to come. I'm Detective B, if you're fascinated by real life, mysteries, and criminal investigations. Tap like, subscribe, and share your opinion in the comments. I'd love to know where you're watching from and what you think about today's case. Make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new episode. Until next time, stay curious, stay vigilant. And remember, in true crime, the line between fact and perception is often thinner than we realize.